Hello, welcome to Football Geeks. My guest this evening is the author of a fantastic new book exploring the history of Portuguese football. It's entitled Bring Me That Horizon, and it charts the birth, growth and success of Portugal's national sport. It gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Miguel Lourenço Pereira. Miguel, boa noite.
Thank you so much for having me, Phil. It's quite an honor to be here chatting about the thing we love the most, football. In this
Of
case,
course.
about my native country, and
Yeah.
talk about the book. It's been a fantastic experience to write and to be chatting about it.
Mate, I've read the book. It is fantastic. I mean, in reading it, it made me realise how little I know about Portugal, both politically and from a past football perspective. I mean, obviously, interest in Portugal has polarised over the last 25 years due to this, many successes of the national team. But what your book does, it plugs those gaps in knowledge that existed prior to that, and it does it admirably. But firstly, could you explain to our listeners, what does the book's title, Bring Me That Horizon, mean? What's the meaning behind the title?
Yeah, I've heard rumors that it's connected with that Sheffield rock band from the 80s and 90s. That's not true. Basically, it's a sentence that you hear at the final of the first film of Pirates of the Caribbean by Jack Sparrow, which in turn was quite stolen from the Portuguese sailors of the 16th and 17th century, because Portugal really was the first nation to create the concept of globalization. Back in the day, in the 15th, 16th century, Portuguese sailors were all around the world, discovering new lands for Europeans. Of course, there was already people living there in America, in Africa, in Asia. But for the European perspective, they was the first one to arrive. They found out where Brazil was. They turned around Africa from one point to the other. They went as far as Indonesia and islands in the Pacific. So even a Portuguese sailor was the first one to turn around the world, although he did it for the flags of Spain. So they were really the kings of the ocean back in the day. It was a sentence they usually said, and they wanted to conquer new horizons. They wanted always to find out new places to be, new places to get fortunes, to get new experiences. And Portuguese football, in a sense, has emulated that, because over the past 20, 25 years, Portuguese football has been all around Europe. Its players, its managers, even its football agents, they are all over the place, and they kind of started to conquer the continent after so many decades where, like you said at the beginning, Portugal was a great unknown for most people in Europe. People had memories of the Eusebio days back in the 66 World Cup, or some Benfica displays in the European Cup. They would know another one or two Portuguese clubs from the European nights, but that was it. And after the mid-90s, with that generation of Figo and Rui Costa and Paulo Sousa, that went to Italy and to Spain and started to play for the bigger teams and started to make Portugal more knowledgeable to fans all around Europe and around the world. And then the presence of Portugal in the World Cups and in the European Championships in the summer also cemented that position. So in a sense, when Mourinho arrived in England to conquer the Premier League, and later on Cristiano Ronaldo as well, they were also searching for new horizons. They were emulating those sailors back in the day. So I thought it would be a good homage to the Portugal from the past and the Portugal from the present, to connect those sides of the story.
Yeah, it does that fantastically. I mean, you in the early 60s, as you say, there was Benfica and the Sporting Lisbon. They were winning trophies, and then there was this blank space in between 1965 through to 1966. Obviously, it was the World Cup until kind of the mid 80s. That's football continued in Portugal. It didn't just stop. It just seems that it kind of it went mute for a little while. We'll come back to that later, because I think there was some political reasons to why football stalled for a while in Portugal, in Salazar's Portugal, wasn't it? But there's no doubting there is a strong connection between Africa and Portugal. I've read somewhere that Lisbon's is nearer to Africa than it is to kind of northern Europe, isn't it? It's closer in distance, and there's a heavy African influence within the Portuguese game. Can you talk us about through the history of that? What happened there?
Yeah, basically, I think Portugal and France, but France is more restricted to the Maghreb. So towards Algeria and Tunisia or Morocco, and they also benefited from that. But Portugal, like I said before, they were the first globalized nation. So when they had the colonial empires, such as the British had all around the world, the Spanish had mostly in South America and Central America. Portugal had lands in South America, as in Brazil, until the 19th century. They had lands in Asia, both in Indonesia and India, until that same century. But the last colonies they had were in Africa. The first and last, because the Portuguese Empire was the last one to dismantle back in the 1970s. So that connection with Africa and Portuguese, the continental European Portuguese, let's say, was very intense from a large period of its history. And also the presence of Portugal in Africa, in the colonies now known as independent nations, such as Mozambique and Angola and Guinea, is very strong as well. So basically, what happened was Portugal could benefit from that, in the sense that the African player, as we know, it's quite different from the European and also the South American. They also have different traits, and the African player was faster, was stronger, and it was more technical than the European player. So when Portugal started to lure from scouting clubs in Africa and scouting the clubs that were playing in the local leagues and import that talent to the continentals, especially to the Lisbon clubs, Benfica, Sporting, and Belenenses. They started to see they had a gold mine there they could exploit. So during the 1950s and 60s, Portugal the clubs didn't have money to sign players from overseas, but they could count on the quality players that came from Africa, and that enabled Benfica to create an all-conquering side. During the 60s, they played 5 European Cup finals during that decade. They won 2, they lost 3, and Sporting as well won a Cup Winners' Cup, also with a lot of players coming from Africa. And of course, the Portuguese national team played the first World Cup of their history in 1966 and went all the way to the semi-finals, losing with England to 2-1 in the semi-finals, though they won the 3rd place against the Soviet Union. So it was a team mostly based on players born in Africa. So that connection was always there. And after the independence of those countries, because of civil war, because of poverty, a lot of people from those new founded countries in the end came back to Europe to live in Portugal, because they thought they would be better here in the old metropolis, the same way that in England, a lot of people from Pakistan and from India and from the Caribbeans and Africa went to live in London and Birmingham, Manchester, and Liverpool, because they found they were a better quality of life there than in their native countries. That created a new generation of players who were or born in Africa, or they have been born in Portugal, but with African parents. So they had the same genetic structure, they had the same mentality, they had the same lust for a more technical football, a more fast football, strong football. And that generation presented itself as the core of the team that won the Euro 2016. A lot of players were either born in Africa, like Eder, who scored the winning goal in the final against France, or they were sons of people who have been born in Africa and had arrived in Portugal just a few years prior to their birth. So the connection has been always there. And emotionally, it's different for a Portuguese supporter from other different European countries, because their connection with Africa is more intense, culturally is more present in the music, in the gastronomy. So there is social issues, there are racist issues in Portuguese society, but at the same time, I think Portugal is probably the country in Europe that better connected with the African essence of the game. So a lot of people usually say that Jorge Weah was the first African player to win the Ballon d'Or, and that's not true, because Eusebio won it back in 1965. He had an European passport, of course, being Portuguese, but he was born in Africa and lived in Africa until he was 18, so he was African for sure. So in the sense that Portugal is the only country in Europe that is able to bridge the two type of footballers, the European born and the African born, into one. That gave them a special weapon they could use to compete against bigger and better national sides.
Yeah. I'm not going to go into the African players too much, because I've asked you to name 3 of your favourite players. I'm sure there's going to be some African influence amongst those. So I won't ask you about those players. We'll save that up to a little bit later. But we spoke a little bit earlier of that blank space between 1966 and maybe 1984 when Portugal qualified for the European Championship. They had a fantastic side back then as well. It was, but it was very much. wasn't it was the exception to the rule around that time to have a Portuguese team that was kind of pulling together for the nation. But in your book, you talk about the political reasons, the obstacles that stalled the progress of Portuguese football. What were they? What happened during those years?
Yeah. Well, first of all, to get to the tournaments, the World Cups and the Euros was much harder back then than it is now, because obviously the World Cups had 16 teams, only 8 or 9 came from Europe, so you had to be the very best. The Euros had 4 teams until the 80s, so it was very hard to get there. Even during the 80s and early 90s, were only 8 teams, so it was really tough. And he really had to have a good generation of players, quality players that could perform in Portugal. Always had that trouble. But the essence, like you said, was the political influence the fascist regime had over Portuguese football, because Portugal had the most long-standing fascist regime in all Europe. People usually, when thinking of fascist regimes, think of obviously of the Nazi Germany, of the fascist regime in Italy, even in Spain with the fascist regime of Franco, who won a civil war. But Salazar outlasted them all, and the regime in Portugal was almost 50 years old. So that shaped a lot the way Portuguese are today. It shaped their mentality, it shaped their way of living, and of course, it shaped his football culture. And differently to what happened in Italy and Spain, where the regime was very much pro football and they were very much into the game and wanted to exploit the game politically wise, Portugal had a mentality much more similar to Nazi Germany. They were afraid of football. They thought it was a game for the masses they will not be able to control. So they would prefer always more sports like gymnastics or individual sports that more easy, more tolerable to the regime. So Salazar was also a very conservative man, very religious man, and he did all he could in his power to get football underdeveloped in Portugal during the 40s and 50s. And basically forbade huge setups from the principal clubs, so players until they were 17, 18 wouldn't be able to perform at the highest level. That made obviously a long delay in the evolution of the football player as such. And also he favored the more amateur approach to the competition. The professionalism only arrived in the late 50s. And the only thing that he did that helped and beneficiated Portuguese football was making a bridge to what we were told before, the connection with Africa, because when the African colonies started to claim their independence, following the example of the other nations around them, they were already getting those from France or from the United Kingdom or from Germany. Salazar did everything he could to prevent that. There was a civil war that lasted almost for 13 years between the continental Portugal and the colonies. And for propaganda issues, it was a good sign for him to have a national side with a lot of African-born players, especially if they were black players, so he could pretend that everyone was Portuguese the same, even if they were born in Lisbon or in Luanda. So that increased the way Portuguese started to scout in Africa, to bring those talents to Europe, and that was the only thing that helped develop the game, because otherwise all the policies he made against protecting the infrastructures of the club, building decent stadiums, favoring the economics of the clubs, he made Portugal, who had started in the 20s and 30s almost at pair level with France and Spain, countries from Southern Europe, made them be really delayed in their evolution. And also they had the issue in the 70s with the introduction of total football. All the football pyramid changed, because until then basically it was a game ruled by Southern Europe, and then it moved north, it moved to the Netherlands, it moved to Germany, to West Germany, it moved to the United Kingdom, of course. So those years were also difficult years, and only in the 90s where the tactical evolution of the game again turned its way on south, was Portugal able finally to claim their place in the elite.
Yeah, I'm not actually saying that Northern European football isn't as good as Southern European football, but there definitely seems a difference in style, doesn't there? Even the total football of like, you know, Ajax and then there was the Teutonic kind of Bayern Munich. Bayern was beautiful, but there didn't seem to be a spontaneity to it that there is in Southern European football, and Bayern were just a kind of a bulldozer of a team. They just ground opposition into kind of submission. Whereas you look at the great sides of Southern Europe, I mean Porto to an extent, and Real Madrid, they seem to play with more panache, and there's a difference in style. And this brings me on to,
I would say the northern are the Panzers, like you said, the tanks, and the southern are like the pure breed horses. They can do the same thing, but it doesn't sound the same. It doesn't look the same. So there's a difference there, yeah, for sure.
I think there's a difference in mentality as well. There's more of a kind of onus on flair above solidity. I talk about this a lot, the solidity above flair. It's a trait that's been endemic to the British game, and it's sported to a degree, and I think it's held us back. But in Portugal, you really value those creative players, which leads us on to what we're going to talk about next, because Brazil has their great strikers and Italy has their fantastic defenders. In Portugal, you have an obsession with the winger. All of the Portuguese greats seem to be wingers. What do you think brings that about? What makes that so?
I think it's both physical and mentality. Physical in the sense that Portuguese are low stature, height levels allow them to have a low gravity center, so they are more technical players for sure. They have more flair, more speed, and that helped to create the image of the short wingman that used to patrol the line. Players like Shalan in the 80s and Futre, then moving on to Figo, of course, and then of course Quaresma and Cristiano Ronaldo and Nani. They always have similar traits in that situation, and also the mentality, the showboatman, the showmanship, the way that they feel football is more than just a sport that you win. It's a sport that you win, but you also have to entertain. You also have to make the people get up from their places. I usually use the comparison in England. For instance, if you see a match from the Premier League to League Two, if you win a corner, people just rise from the seat and they cheer because they feel there's an opportunity for a throw into the area. Whether in Portugal, you only get people coming from their seats if the winger passes his marker and then passes another one and then goes at full speed and makes a perfect cross, and that in itself is ticket value worth for many of the people who like to watch football. So in a sense, the winger allow Portuguese best players to be free of defensive roles. That's also important because Portuguese are very lazy in tactical terms, or they were at least. Things have changed, of course, and nowadays in Portuguese better players of the day now are all very tactical aware. But back in the day, they were quite lazy in comparison with the Italians, for instance, that were more disciplined and more straight back. And being a winger allowed you to move forward without tracking back as much, and they allow you to showboat and allow you to feel the pressure, but the positive pressure of having the crowd in the stands right near you, shouting to you directly. You feel yourself as the protagonist of the story, and that's why ever since the 1950s and 60s, when teams started to play with a line of four in the attack, a 4-2-4 or a 4-4-2, then moving to the 4-2-3-1, for instance, there was always the impact of the winger changing games. Also because Portugal, although they had important goal scorers in their history, they never had truly had, apart from Eusebio in the 60s and now Cristiano, those goal scorers that would define games for themselves. They had the killer instinct that other countries produce on a regular basis. So they counted a lot with the winger capacity to improvise, to unblock difficult situations to win matches, and that also gained them a lot of popular support. And people counted more with a trickstery from Futre or turning inside and then a shot from Figo to win a match than to the national player who was playing with the number 9 shirt up front. We usually would play more to guarantee they had the marking of the defenses on him, giving the wingers the space to create the real danger. And that school evolved until the figure of Cristiano Ronaldo, of course, was the guy that started as a wingman, but then turned up to be the deadly killer as well in the box. So he kind of made the transition from from both sides of the story. But also players like Nani and players like now Rafael Leao, who's at Milan, who's also a winger with a shot for goal, and that evolved. But back in the day, the winger was just that. It was a ticket to enjoy life, enjoy the match, and enjoy the game.
Yeah, I mean, many of the great Portuguese match winners have been wingers, haven't they? As you say, there's only really Eusebio who breaks that mold. But moving on, I asked you prior to us coming on air to talk about your three favourite Portuguese footballers. I suspect that I'm going to know who you're talking about, but I did ask you to drop a few surprises in there for me. So from a personal point of view, who are the Portuguese footballers who really excited you over your period as a fan?
Yeah, I will definitely go for my personal favorites, not the best. So to make that clear, the first of all has to be Eusebio, because I grew up in the 80s, 80s, 90s, and until then, Eusebio was the name. If you talk about Portuguese football with everyone around the world, if you said this is all Eusebio, people knew where you're coming from, and he was really, really great. There were times where Eusebio was at par with Pelé, which is very difficult. People now don't have the same perspective because, of course, being Portuguese, he didn't have as good as marketing as other players of that time, but he was a fantastic player. And I had an old video cassette that my father got with a documentary of his life, and it was full of old footage. And I just devoured it. I watched it for hours. In those days back where there were no cell phones and there was no internet, and you only had the cassettes to watch football when it wasn't live on television. So that image of Eusebio playing against North Korea in the World Cup of '66 and Portugal being 3-0 down and Eusebio scoring 4 goals in like an half an hour. It was just one of the greatest individual performances in the history of the game, wherever you look. So he was one of the favorites. And despite I'm being a Porto fan and he being a Benfica legend, that never quite bothered me because it was so good. I could forgive him that for being a Benfica star. Then the second, I would choose Paulo Futre, who was also a player that rose from the late 80s and early 90s. And Futre has been a victim of a poor decision in his career, in a sense that when he won the European Cup with Porto in 1987, it was quite an achievement. Portugal did had an European champion for more than 25 years since Benfica, and being a nation from the periphery of Europe, it was really hard to compete at that level, and that Porto side was really good, and they beat Bayern Munich 2-1 in the final. And Futre played fantastically well in that game, and as he had been playing in the league, so he became one of the most coveted players in football Europe back in the day. And he had offers to go to Serie A, to go to Inter Milan, or to play in Spain for Atletico Madrid. Now, I lived in Spain for 16 years, and I know how much the people from Atletico love Putre. And I saw Putre, I met him in the Vicente Calderon, I've talked with him, and I've talked with the fans, and there's one of the most beautiful love stories in European football. But if he had signed with Inter, if he had went to the Serie A back in the day where the Serie A was like the Premier League today, the strongest league by far, where the best teams were, where the best players were, playing in a side that would eventually won the Scudetto, with players like Mateos and Andreas Brema and Klinsmann, and the quality of the time they had, he would be a legend much more than he is now. And the people who saw him play know he's a legend for sure, but the people who only heard of him would have heard from a different perspective. It would be at the same level, of course, of Gullit and Van Basten had the exit they had with Milan and other players of his generation. But by signing with Atletico Madrid, he never again played in the European Cup. He never again won a major title. With Atletico, he won a couple of Spanish Cups as well. Then he went to Marseille, but he signed with Marseille after they won the Champions League and they were relegated for that affair with Valenciennes. So another poor choice of decision of his career. And then he moved to AC Milan and he had terrible injuries, ended up in England, played with Estam for a couple of matches as well. But he was not the same Putre as before. And he also lived a difficult period for the national side because he was present at the 1986 World Cup, but he only played a few minutes. And when Portugal came back to the World Cup was in 2002, he already retired by then. So people didn't have the opportunity to watch him at the highest level, but he was a fantastic player. And I always tell people, go to YouTube, watch the videos, and get in love because he's that kind of player. And my last choice would be Deco. Deco is a Brazilian born, but is a Porto legend. I watched Deco play his first match in Portugal when he was playing with a lower team, Alverca. Then he moved to my father's team, which is Salgueiros, which is the third team of the city of Porto, the poor man's team. And he played there for half a year. And I remember watching them play, and I already fell in love with him. I never had the idea he'd become the player he ended up to be. A 2 times Champions League winner, one of the best players of his generation. But when he moved to Porto and when he met Mourinho, they simply made a connection that made an imprint not only in the history of the club, in the history of Portuguese football, but also in the history of European football as well, because Porto became a side that won consecutively the UEFA Cup and the Champions League, and that doesn't happen quite often. And then he moved to Barcelona, and despite the team having players like Ronaldinho and Eto'o and the young Messi, he was also one of the stars of the side for a couple of years, won the Champions League there, a couple of Spanish leagues as well. So then he moved to England, he played with Chelsea, then he went back to Brazil. And with the Portuguese national side, he was very important because he was the first Brazilian naturalized player in a long time, and he caused an immediate impact. He played with Portugal that lost the final of the Euro 2004 against Greece. Then he went on to play in the 2006 World Cup, Euro 2008, 2010 World Cup as well. So he's one of the most capped players in Portuguese history, one of the best. So it's a personal favorite of mine, and I know people would expect me to choose Cristiano Ronaldo, which is a huge player, fantastic player. But if I have to choose one that I saw on a day-to-day basis, because I've been a Porto supporter, having a place, an annual seat in the stadium, so I got like 4 or 5 seasons. I watched him play every 15 days. It was just a miracle to watch him control the midfield with his talent and his capacity to win matches of his own.
Yeah, it's funny. He had a kind of metronomic control of that center of the park, didn't he?
Yeah.
He was the ticking clock of the team, and even when he went to Spain, he was playing amongst those incredible midfield quartet. He always seemed like he was the one who dictated things. So his influence on European and Portuguese football is vast. And I've seen future play as well. And one thing that I liked about him, he was tigerish. You know what I mean? Yeah. He had that
relentless,
edge. That, and also that edge soon that all the great players have, a little bit of nastiness thrown in there as well, which I love. I love that in players. I love players little bit of needle, as we call it in Britain. But it's interesting you say Eusebio as well, because I had this debate when I was guesting on a podcast, and it was about. First, it was a question about Pele, really. It was would the question of Pele being the greatest player of all time been negated if he would have played in Europe? And I think the same stands with Eusebio. If he would have played football outside of Portugal, would it been undoubtedly one of the greatest? Because people regard him as one of the greatest. But if he would have took that step to Italy, like you say, Future was he was out of time. His timeline was all wrong, wasn't it? He just things didn't happen at the right time, or he was slightly out of time. But
Eusebio had the offer, but of course, like we said before, being Portugal a fascist regime, the regime wouldn't let him go. There was a law that forbade him to sign for Real Madrid and Inter and Juventus, who were all after him because they knew how great he was. And to think in perspective, like you say, of course, Pelé, if he had played in Europe, he would be even greater than he is to our eyes. And being a player that never played in Europe, and still we reckon him as one of the 3, 4, 5 greatest players of all time, says everything we need to know about him. But Eusebio took Benfica to 5 European Cup finals. And let's put that in perspective. A Portuguese team, a poor Portuguese team, because Benfica had no money. All the players were homegrown. And they were playing like finals against Barcelona, Real Madrid, AC Milan, Inter Milan, Manchester United. They were playing against the very best of Europe. And in a decade, they were in half of the European Cup finals. And that's all due. There was a great team, of course. There was other quality players there. There was not only Eusebio, but having Eusebio made a difference. So if you take that Eusebio from that Benfica side, they would be a very competitive side, of course. They would be very good. Probably they wouldn't get to as many finals as they did. But if you pick that Eusebio and you put it in Real Madrid or you put in Inter Milan, or you put in Juventus, or you put in Liverpool and Manchester United of today, he would probably be a beast, a complete beast in the history of the game, and he would dominate it for sure.
Yeah, definitely. That's it. I mean, the only kind of this thing about him not being is the fact that he didn't play for another team in Europe, but he scored against all those great teams, those
Yeah,
great teams in Europe. So
was
there's
was
no,
the MVP of a World Cup, was the best scorer of that World Cup as well. So he
yeah,
performed. He scored 2 goals against Brazil in '66. He scored against England. He scored 4 against North Korea. He scored against the Soviet Union. So when he had to play with the bigger teams, with the bigger clubs, he always performed. He was not a player that you go and watch the matches and say, no, he was marked out of the game against the better side. So he just scored against the minnows or stuff like that. No, he performed really well against the top sides.
yeah, great players, guys. Really intriguing and interesting choices there. I really enjoyed that. But we'll move on now. Where do you see Portuguese football heading domestically and in a national team context over the next decade or so? Do you see another Portuguese team winning a major European title in the next decade?
I think they're going on separate ways. Portuguese national side is getting better and better by the time, because Portuguese youth setups are really brilliant for a country that has only 10 million inhabitants. There are less people in Portugal than in Greater London. So to
Mm.
be able to have so many good players in all the generations, you look back and you always find world-class players in Portugal over the last 30 years. And they keep on coming. You see Benfica side now has a lot of under 23 players who will end up playing in the Premier League for sure. Porto as well, Sporting, and they're already the players that already are in the big sides from 23 years until 26 or 27. So over the next 10 years, I can imagine a national side with the Bernardo Silvas, the Bruno Fernandes, the Ruben Dias, the Cancelos, the Leao, but also with all the other younglings that are coming up. And Portugal will be, for me, one of the favorites to win the Euros this summer, and will obviously be one of the favorites to at least to try to win every single international competition for the following decade, because the players are there, and Portugal has developed a tactical awareness of the game that it lacked until the 2000s, 2010s. So they have become more competitive, more the way they read the game more intelligently. So I think the national side will always improve. But at club level, I think the change we are about to see with the Champions League and with the European competitions, and of course the ghost of the Super League in the future, will make countries like Portugal more peripheral than they already are. If we see how world football is going, focusing essentially on the nations with the capacity to invest, and in Premier League takes a large advantage even to the other important nations like Spain or Italy or Germany or even France. And Portugal is way back, and it will never be able to compete at the same level. So we have to remember Porto, Mourinho's Porto was the last team outside the big four leagues to win the Champions League. And I think we will never going to see a team from outside the big four winning the Champions League, at least not in the next decade, because there are so many good teams on those four leagues. And of course, the money that is invested, especially on the Premier League, makes it very hard to countries like Portugal or the Netherlands or Belgium or Scotland or Greece or Turkey or Russia when they competed to be at the highest level. You could have and also because the teams, of course, they don't have the same capacity to invest in the market, so they are starting to sell their talent younger than they usually were. When Deco moved from Porto to Barcelona, Porto was able financially to keep him from another year because he had an offer from Barcelona when Porto won the UEFA Cup, and Porto was able to convince him to stay another season. Now Portuguese clubs can't do that because their financial situation makes them to sell their best talent after just one good season. We had an example recently of Luis Diaz, for instance, who had a great season with Porto, and he was sold in January for Liverpool. He didn't even finish the season. So that makes it even harder for Portuguese sides to compete at the highest level. But the thing is, they are there. Porto has just won the first leg against Arsenal. Porto and Benfica played the last 8 or last 16 matches of the Champions League over the last few decades. So they are still a competitive side, but to get there to the final and to win it will be very, very hard. And over the next years, with a new format of the Champions League that we are all still trying to figure out a little bit how it will work, but it gives me the idea that will make it even more difficult for teams like Porto, Benfica, Sporting. The same could be applied to Ajax and PSV and stuff like that, to compete against the cities and the Liverpools and the Arsenals and the Barcelonas and the Bayerns and the PSGs and such.
Yeah, I think Portuguese sides are still capable of a surprise, but when you in those kind of, when it used to be two-legged tournaments, they had the kind of power to win those kind of games. But when you're looking at a league system against the elite, the moneyed elite of Europe, it makes it all the more difficult, doesn't it, Miguel?
Yeah.
Anyway, let's talk. Where's this fantastic book of yours available? Because I've read it, guys. All the listeners out there, it's fantastic. You've got to get your hands on it because it's one of those rare gems that tell stories that you probably haven't heard before. And there's not enough books of that like that out there. So Miguel, where can you get your hands on it?
Well, essentially worldwide at Amazon. So you can purchase it on Amazon, on the Amazon UK, but also national wide. There's Amazon Spain, France, Germany, Italy. You can purchase from there, and also in the UK in bookstores, with Pitch, who is the publisher of the book as well, with Waterstone, with Harrods. In continental Europe, you can buy it in the Fnac stores. So basically, it's all around, but I would recommend Amazon because there you can get it faster, and also you can read the reviews of people who have enjoyed the book. And thankfully, we have a good ones at least for now. So I hope that also motivates people to get an idea of the book and to get motivated to buy and to discover all those stories, like you said, of the essence, the identity of the Portuguese game.
Miguel, you've been a terrific guest. Thank you for talking to us, and thank you for writing the book, because you've singularly increased my knowledge of Portuguese history and football in doing so. Where there was once ignorance, now there's wisdom. So, so thanks for that, guys. Join us next time for Football Geeks with some more great guests and some more fantastic stories. For now, adios.